وصحبه أجمعين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم اللهم إنا نعوذ بك من أن نشرك بك شيئا نعلمه ونستغفرك لما لا نعلمه ربنا لك الحمد كثيرا طيبا مباركا Alhamdulillah atas nikmat ruang waktu yang Engkau pinjamkan dapat kami meneruskan urusan kehidupan untuk hari ini serta hari-hari mendatang. Kami rafakkan tangan-tangan kami dengan penuh rasa kehambaan, memohon redha dan restu-Mu dengan penuh pengharapan agar majlis ini diberkati. Rabbana ya Rahmanu ya Rahim. Kurniakanlah kami seluruh warga pendidikan kekuatan, kesihatan dan keafiatan untuk kami melaksanakan segala tugas yang dipertanggungjawabkan. Ilhamkanlah kami sebaik-baik pandangan dan buah fikiran dalam urusan dan setiap tindakan, saling muafakat dalam membuat keputusan, menjaga produktiviti, memudayakan gerak kerja yang cemerlang. Allahumma ja'al jam'ana hadha jam'an marhuma wa tafarruqana min ba'dihi tafarruqan ma'suma. ولا تجعل اللهم فينا ولا معنا ولا من يتبعنا شقيا ولا مترودا ولا محروما اللهم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Amin, amin ya rabbal alamin. Alhamdulillah, terima kasih diucapkan kepada Ustaz Syahzan Izlan Haji Manja atas pimpinan bacaan doa itu tadi. Assalamualaikum, salam sejahtera. Pembuka kata lidah bicara, izinkan saya mulakan acara. Semoga majlis disambut ceria. Kompang bergema pusaka bangsa dipalu oleh si anak muda. Hadir tuan, meriah suasana, kami menyambut penuh gembira. Yang dihormati barisan timbalan pengarah peperiksaan Lembaga Peperiksaan, barisan panel jemputan InCoSSAA 2023, wakil Jabatan Pendidikan Negeri, wakil pejabat pendidikan daerah, wakil guru serta hadirin hadirat warga dewan yang dikasihi sekalian. Selamat datang ke International Conference on Secondary School Alternative Assessment InCoSSAA 2023 yang juga dikenali sebagai Persidangan Antarabangsa Pentaksiran Alternatif Sekolah Menengah 2023. Puji dan syukur kehadrat Ilahi kerana dengan limpah kurnianya dapat sama-sama kita berkumpul pada pagi Jumaat yang indah ini di Movenpick Hotel and Convention Center, Sepang. Para hadirin yang dihormati sekalian, hari terakhir International Conference on Secondary School Alternative Assessment 2023 yang diadakan di Movenpick Hotel akan diteruskan. Tanpa melengahkan masa lagi, marilah kita mulakan sesi kita pada pagi ini dengan sesi pembentangan InCoSSAA 2023. Sebelum itu, izinkan saya membacakan sedikit biodata pembentang kita pada pagi ini. Beliau mendapat pendidikan ijazah sarjana muda Perguruan Pendidikan Khas Masalah Pendengaran Pendidikan Rendah dari Institut Perguruan Guru Malaysia pada tahun 2011. Beliau melanjutkan pelajaran di peringkat ijazah sarjana pendidikan dalam bidang pengurusan dan pentadbiran pendidikan dari Open University pada tahun 2017 dan seterusnya menyambung pengajian ijazah sarjana Doktor Falsafah Pendidikan dalam bidang kepimpinan pendidikan di Universiti Tun Hussein On Malaysia pada tahun 2020. Kini, insan hebat ini merupakan pensyarah universiti, Pusat Kajian Pendidikan dan Kesejahteraan Komuniti serta Ketua Program Prasiswazah-Pendidikan Khas. Dipersilakan yang berusaha Dr. Muhammad Norazmi bin Nordin untuk menyampaikan sesi pembentangan beliau pada pagi ini dengan tajuk Assessment Practices in Special Education, Adequacy and Appropriateness. Dipersilakan.
A'udzubillahi minasyaitonirrajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin wassalatu wassalam ala asyrafil anbiya wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Qala rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Qala Allah Ta'ala fi kitabihil aziz. A'udzubillahi minasyaitonirrajim. Qala Yusuf li abihi ya abati inni ra'aitu ahada asyar kaukaban was-samsa wal qamara ra'aituhum lis-sajidin. Sadaqallahul azim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, salam Malaysia Madani. Baik, alhamdulillah syukur kepada Allah Subhanahu wa taala kerana dengan limpah kurnia, dengan izin Allah dapat juga saya berdiri kat depan ni untuk sama-sama berkongsi lah. Saya sebenarnya sedikit, bila saya dapat jemputan, disebabkan sebelum ni, rakan saya yang lain lah. Bila saya dapat jemputan, saya rasa macam very excited. We share with you all lah tentang pentaksiran pendidikan khas ini. Tapi once saya dah masuk ke dewan ini, saya nampak semuanya otai-otai. Saya mula nervous kan. So sebab tu tadi bila duduk di tempat pembentang tu, kerusi disediakan tu, saya diam je, saya tak buat apa. Sebab nervous kan. Tapi it's good bila nervous, kita ada satu passion untuk memberikan insya-Allah yang terbaik lah. Dan saya ucapkan terima kasih sekali lagi kerana yang ada di depan saya ini merupakan orang-orang hebat yang telah berada dalam pendidikan khas, telah dalam tempoh yang lama nak dibandingkan dengan saya lah. Okey. Dan saya juga nak mengucapkan terima kasih kepada lembaga peperiksaan kerana menjemput saya, dan juga terima kasih juga kepada tuan atau pengarah, tuan timbalan-timbalan pengarah dan juga penolong-penolong pengarah serta pegawai-pegawai lembaga peperiksaan lah kerana memberi kepercayaan ini. Okey. So seperti mana yang telah diberitahu tadi oleh Tuan Pengerusi Majlis, saya sebenarnya seorang bekas guru pendidikan khas lah. Sebelum saya berada di UKM sebagai pensyarah pendidikan khas, walaupun tak lama di sekolah, dalam 10 tahun lah, 10 tahun lebih kurangnya di sekolah, tapi saya dapat melihat bagaimana pentaksiran untuk murid-murid berkeperluan pendidikan khas berlaku lah. Okey. Dan saya memberi pujian kepada guru-guru pendidikan khas kerana bersungguh-sungguh dalam mentaksir dan juga memberikan yang terbaik kepada MBPK kita, insya-Allah. Okey, jadi untuk hari ini, saya dalam masa 40 minit, insya-Allah. Saya kalau bercakap bila kuliah, sampai student kata, "Doktor, dah sampai waktu makan." Sebab saya takut bila bercakap tu terlebih. Okay. Tapi insya-Allah saya dah set masa 40 minit. InsyaAllah kita settlekan dalam 30 atau 40 minit. Okay. So hari ini saya diberikan tanggungjawab untuk membentangkan berkaitan dengan kecukupan dan juga kesesuaian. Okay. Kecukupan macam mana nak dikatakan cukup taksiran untuk murid berkeperluan pendidikan khas ataupun sesuai untuk mereka lah. Okay. Okey, besar sangat pula muka. Okey, ini saya lah. Saya sebenarnya yang seperti disebut tadi, saya bermula dengan ijazah sarjana muda perguruan pendidikan khas dalam bidang masalah pendengaran. Saya bergelumang dengan bahasa isyarat ni daripada awal lah, sehingga saya dipostingkan ke sekolah pun masih lagi berisyarat. Dan bila mesyuarat berlangsung, kita senyap, kan? Guru besar, pengetua je bercakap, cikgu-cikgu senyap. Tetapi inputnya berlaku kerana kita saling berisyarat antara satu sama lain dalam bilik mesyuarat tersebut. Okay, dan saya teruskan pengajian ke OUM, Takbiran Pendidikan, dan seterusnya ke UTHM lah. Dan entah bagaimana, saya mohon untuk lepas jawatan, saya ke UKM diminta saya untuk menjaga program pendidikan khas masalah penglihatan. Padahal saya pendengaran daripada mula, mengajar pun pendengaran, kemudian sedikit ataupun bersama juga dengan masalah pembelajaran, tapi akhirnya di universiti masalah penglihatan. Tapi good untuk saya, untuk kerjaya saya kerana saya boleh menempuh berhadapan dengan ketiga-tiga kita punya program lah. Okey, nak cakap pendidikan khas lebih lanjut pun tuan-tuan dan puan lebih tahu daripada saya. Tak hilang lagi nervous ni, masih lagi nervous. Ada orang JPN, ada orang PPD, guru-guru otai kan. Dan bila saya open untuk question di dalam perkumpulan tertentu, ada banyaklah perkara yang guru-guru minta saya sampaikan. Tetapi mungkin tak semua kot. 40 minit kan. Kalau 3 hari mungkinlah kan. Dan juga sebahagian besarnya telah pun disebutkan sebelum ini dalam forum dan juga pembentangan semalam. Okey. So tak payah tengok lama-lama lah ni. Okey ada lagi muka saya sebab saya nak bagi ingat kan, sebab saya baru kalau keseluruhan dalam dunia pendidikan khas ni baru 13 tahun lah kan, 13 tahun. Dan mungkin tak ramai lagi yang kenal saya. Jadi setiap slide saya letak muka saya supaya orang kenal saya dan ingat saya. Ini pensyarah UKM yang pendidikan khas tu. Okey, dan tak ramai pun pensyarah pendidikan khas di Malaysia ni. Di UKM ada 5 orang sahaja. Tinggal 5 orang daripada berbelas hari tu dah pencen semua, tinggal 5 orang. Kemudian di UPSI pun dah tinggal tak ramai dah. Kemudian di USM saya dikhabarkan tinggal seorang dah pensyarah pendidikan khas dia. Jadi guru-guru berminat silalah mohon untuk ke UKM juga ataupun ke universiti. Okey. So untuk permulaan hari ini, bila kita berbicara tentang pendidikan khas, saya ada satu pengalaman yang saya rasa sampai hari ini pengalaman itu membuatkan saya merubah cara saya berfikir tentang pendidikan khas. Okey, pengalaman saya ini, saya pernah dulu satu ketika saya dapat seorang murid yang unik pada ketika itu bagi saya, kerana murid saya ni waktu saya dapat dia tu, dia sekolah rendah lah, darjah 3. Saya dapat dia masuk dalam kelas saya. Sebelum tu memang cikgu-cikgu lain dah ajar dia dah lah. Cuma saya belum sempat bertemu dengan dia. Dan bila saya bertemu dengan dia, waktu tu dia darjah 3, umurnya 10 tahun. Dan dia pendidikan khas kan, dia sepatut 9 tapi 10 lah waktu tu. Dia dilahirkan di tag waktu awal tu dia masalah pendengaran. Dia tak dengar. So bila dia lahir tu masa baby tu kan, mak ayah dia panggil dia tak dengar lah. Dia ada masalah pendengaran. Dan dalam masa yang sama dia ada masalah penglihatan, sehingga kan pada umur dia 2 tahun, setahun lebih tu 2 tahun, ini cerita mak dia ceritalah, penglihatan dia tak nampak. So bila dia bergerak tu dia nampak, kita nampaklah dia seorang yang kehilangan penglihatan. Jadi bila dia darjah 3 dalam kelas saya, dia totally pekak kan. Orang pekak suka kita panggil dia pekak kan. Sebab saya ada saya pergi ke satu saya bagi ceramah. Bila saya sebut pekak tu, selepas daripada saya bagi ucapan tu, ada pegawai-pegawai tu datang jumpa saya. Doktor cakap pekak, orang tak marah Saya cakap memang orang pekak memang suka kita panggil dia pekak. Tak nak kita sebut masalah pendengaran ke, ketidakupayaan ke, the terms, the words, masalah dan sebagainya tu, orang pekak tak sukalah kan. Dia suka kita panggil dia pekak. Tetapi dalam terms pendidikan kita kena guna juga ketidakupayaan. Sebabnya nanti kita nak provide kita punya educational service. Kan, baru kita tahu kat mana ketidakupayaan dia. Okey, berbalik cerita tadi. Saya dapat dia darjah 3 tu, dia dah totally dia pekak dan juga dia totally blind. Kan? So dia, kadang saya terfikirlah kan, murid saya ni, kita kalaulah dia pekak and then dia tahu apa yang berlaku di sekeliling dia. Kan? Kalau dia pekak dia boleh nampak. Kalau dia buta, at least dia boleh dengar apa yang berlaku di sekeliling dia. Tetapi sekarang ni Allah bagi pada dia pekak, dia totally pekak dan dia totally blind. Saya terfikir, bila saya dapat dalam kelas, saya balik saya terfikir, saya tidur, baring, saya fikir. Sebenarnya kan nama dia Salahuddin, saya panggil dia Salahuddin lah. Saya duk fikir, Salahuddin ni tahu tak sebenarnya dia ni apa benda? Dia tu apa? Kan kita tahu kita ni manusia, kita boleh hidup, berjalan dan sebagainya. Tapi saya terfikirlah, dia sebenarnya dia tahu tak dia tu apa? Dia tu apa? Siapa dia, apa dia bentuk, apa yang berlaku dia tahu tak? Saya duduk, saya terfikir lama benda tu. Saya duduk fikir macam mana ni? Dan yang paling saya respect adalah mak dia lah. Saya tak pernah jumpa ayah dia. Mak dia lah yang selalu bawa dia pergi sekolah naik wheelchair, daripada turun kereta kancil dia, tolak sampai masuk kelas. Duduk, nanti balik pun sama, mak dia akan ambil dia, tarik, masuk kereta. Yang saya nampak kat situ. Tapi dekat rumah, wallahualam, lebih hebat, lebih dahsyat kot. Dan yang update saya terbaru saya dapat, dia dah tak ada lah. Kan? Biasanya yang macam ni dia, Allah adil untuk dia kan. So saya terfikir benda tu. Dan saya terfikir, macam mana saya nak mengajar dia dalam kelas, murid macam ni. Apatah lagi saya nak mentaksir pencapaian dia. Saya duk terfikir dan saya ambil keputusan berserta dengan cikgu-cikgu lain ketika itu. Dia kata, kita just biar Salahuddin just sit down there, duduk kat meja dia, duduk sahaja selagi mana dia tak cedera, dia tak jatuh, dia tak sakit dan dia tak melakukan perkara yang boleh mencederakan orang lain, which is saya rasa macam dia tak mampulah untuk mencederakan orang lain. Kan? Tapi selagi mana dia selamat dekat situ, kita just biar dia duduk kat situ. So saya pun buat perkara yang sama, saya buat benda tu lah. Saya biar dia kat situ. Dalam kelas tu ada 2 orang. Seorang lagi kawan dia, which is Chinese, pekak. Dia duduk dalam kelas tu sebab dia kata kita sekarang ni dalam kategori mono apa? Kan kita satu kategori. Kalau dia main dia pekak, kita letak dia pekak. Kalau main dia penglihatan, kita letak penglihatan. Kalau pembelajaran, kita letak pembelajaran. Tapi sekarang ni dia masuk dalam kelas tu kerana dia asalnya adalah pekak. So dalam kelas tu ada 2. Dia seorang dan kawan dia seorang, Chinese. So saya beri tumpuan, saya mengajar kawan dia yang Chinese ni sebab dia pekak. So saya deliver lah pengajaran ikut silibus kan. And then buat pentaksiran macam biasa. Tetapi yang Salahuddin seorang ni, saya biarkan dia kat situ. Sebab apa saya biarkan dia? Sebab saya tak tahu nak buat apa. Saya tanya orang lain pun tak tahu nak buat apa. Kan? Saya tengok dia, bila saya bagi kerja dekat rakan dia tu, saya akan duduk dekat meja dia, saya akan tengok dia. Tengok dia. Dia pun duduk je guys, tak buat apa. Sebab dia tak tahu apa-apa pun dia tak tahu. Sebab dia tak nampak, tak dengar, tak sebagainya, dia tak tahu. So macam itulah keadaannya berlaku 2 bulan, 3 bulan. Sehingga sampai ke hampir separuh tahun. Benda tu berlarutan macam tu. So saya terfikir, tak boleh jadi ni. Kan? And then satu detik ketika, mungkin sama Allah nak tunjuk something, dia bagi saya satu peristiwa yang seolah-olah saya macam terkejut daripada tidur. Tidur yang lama macam orang koma kan, terkejut. Bila saya bagi kerja, tugasan kepada kawan dia, bagi tugasan, and then saya macam biasa saya akan duduk di meja dia, ada 2 meja. And then depan tu ada meja guru lah, kan kelas tak besar mana pun, kecil je. So kawan saya dah bagi tugasan, kawan dia pun bersungguh-sungguh lah tengah buat. Betul tak tu pulang pada dia lah, tapi dia buat lah. Dan saya duduk dekat meja depan murid saya ni. And then bila saya duduk, macam biasa, dekat depan dia tu saya letaklah buku dia. Bukan saya lah, saya dan juga pembantu pengurusan murid, PPM lah kan. Memang kat depan dia tu, walaupun dia tak buat apa-apa, kami memang akan letak buku, letak pensel dan juga pensel color depan dia. Kami pun tak tahu, saja letak. Disebabkan nanti, manalah tahu orang JPN ni dia suka datang mengejut. Kan? Tambah-tambah PPD. Sekolah tu dekat dengan PPD kan. Kadang-kadang PPD datang. Jadi untuk mengelakkan perkara-perkara yang tidak diingini berlaku, So at least lah bila JPN, PPD berjalan tepi mengendap ke kan, ataupun guru besar ke mengendap tepi tu, at least dia nampak lah depan murid saya tu ada benda kan. Walaupun sebenarnya guru besar waktu tu pun dia faham. Cuma dia risau lah kadang PPD, JPN. Tambahan pula kalau jemaah nazir datang kan, lagi pening kepala kan. Jadi itulah saya buat. Kemudian satu masa tu tengah tunggu rakan dia ni buat kerja, dia meraba-raba. Dia meraba-raba tangan, and then dia dapat tangan saya. Dia raba duduk kan. Dia meraba-raba dapatlah tangan saya. Bila dapat tangan saya, dia gosok-gosok. Kan mungkin dia biasa macam tu kan, nak buat apa kan. Murid yang macam itu dia gosok, pegang tangan saya. And then dia letak tangan, dia tarik. Mungkin sense dia tu kuat kan, berkaitan sentuhan ni. Dia tarik, dia letak kat atas buku. Tangan saya kat atas buku. Kemudian dia gaba lagi, dia dapat pensel dia letak dekat sebelah tangan saya. So at that time saya rasa macam apa tahu? Saya rasa macam saya tidur terlalu lama dan orang simbah air dekat muka saya. Saya rasa macam dalam hati saya, what I'm doing sebelum ni. Apa yang aku dah buat sebelum ni dengan student ni. Kan? Timbullah satu perasaan di mana saya rasa waktu tu 4-5 bulan saya biar dia dalam keadaan macam tu, dalam hati saya timbul perasaan. Saya rasa pada waktu tu I am the useless lah, the cikgu yang paling tak berguna dalam dunia lah, rasa kan, dalam perasaan dalam hati. Dia datang sekolah, mak ayah dia hantar dia ke sekolah untuk dia belajar sesuatu, tetapi saya, cikgu yang tidak berguna pada waktu itu tu, saya membiarkan dia tanpa saya buat apa-apa. Apa saya nak jawab nanti kan, bila berhadapan dengan Maha Pencipta. Dia tanya saya, kau cikgu kan, kau cikgu, apa yang kau dah buat dengan murid ni? Dia pergi sekolah, balik sekolah, itu je. Pergi sekolah, balik sekolah, tak dapat apa. So saya rasa pada waktu saya salah cikgu yang paling tidak berguna dalam dunia, bukan kat Malaysia je, kat dalam dunia. Kan? So at that time saya tengok dia, saya tengok PPM saya waktu tu. PPM saya buat muka macam kan. Saya pun tengok dia, saya kata ni Salahuddin. Saya pegang tangan dia, dia tak nampak ke, dia tak dengar ke, saya cakap aje. Saya kata Salahuddin, mulai sekarang ni pukul dekat nak rehat waktu tu 9.30. Mulai saat yang ada ni, saya dekat depan awak ni, cikgu berjanji dengan Salahuddin. Cikgu berjanji dengan hati, dalam sepenuh hati cikgu berjanji dengan Salahuddin, apa pun akan jadi, cikgu akan pastikan juga Salahuddin dapat sesuatu sebelum Salahuddin keluar daripada sekolah ni. Saya cakap depan dia, saya pegang tangan dia. PPM saya dekat belakang tu, dia dah kesat-kesat mata dia lah kan, sebab rasa macam something yang kita dah mengabaikan orang yang datang untuk mendapatkan perkhidmatan kita, tapi kita tak bagi perkhidmatan yang terbaik. So saya pegang tangan dia, saya cakap macam tu. Dia pun macam biasa lah macam itu, tak tahu apa kan. So mulai hari tu saya cari cara bagaimana nak handle murid yang kita panggil multiple disabilities macam ni. Dan saya mengharapkanlah sehingga sekarang kita dah ada usaha-usaha untuk ke arah menjadikan MBPK yang multiple ni sebagai kita punya saya mengharapkan dia menjadi satu yang penting pada kita, supaya saya tak kata kita sekarang ni sistem kita mengabaikan mereka, tidak, ada kan, dan kita berusaha sangat baik ke arah itu. Tetapi kemungkinan ada part yang kita boleh kemaskini lagi, boleh perbaiki berkaitan dengan bagaimana kita nak handle murid macam ni, dan bagaimana kita nak mentaksir dia sampai masa kan. I'm not sure dia tu okey ke tak okey pengajian dia. Sebabnya at last masa dia tahun 3 tu tak dapat lagi. Masa dia naik darjah 4, okey, dia dapat tulis saya tak tahu lah waktu tu penting atau tidak penting sebenarnya saya exposekan dia benda tu. Tetapi masa dia pertengahan dia darjah 4 tu, dia boleh tulis some A, B, C something. dengan ni lah. Dia tonggeng terbalik lah benda tu kan. Sengit dan sebagainya. Tetapi nampak yang dia sebenarnya nak tulis huruf ABC. ABC. Dia 4 tahun di sekolah itu dia boleh tulis sengit-sengit. Tapi dalam hati saya, ia satu yang memuaskan hati saya lah pada waktu tu. Tapi saya tak pastilah sama ada saya expose benda tu penting atau tidak bagi dia pada waktu itu. Kan yang lebih penting sebenarnya anak-anak kita pendidikan khas ini, academic is academic. Ya, kita tak boleh nak kata murid kita murid khas. No, academic tak nak. Nak kemahiran saja pun tak boleh juga. Kan? Kita nak kata kemahiran tak penting, academic saja pun tak cukup juga. Kan? So pada waktu tu saya rasa penting, bolehlah pada waktu tu. Lagipun saya masa tu baru lagi kan. So tak ni lagi lah. Cuma mungkin selepas ni ada lagi yang berkaitan yang lebih baik untuk diusahakan kepada dia lah. Okey. Dan juga disebut tadi academic skill dan juga domain. Sekarang ni apa yang saya terlibat juga sebenarnya dalam semakkan ke tak silap saya tahun lepas pentaksiran alternatif sekolah menengah ni. Okey. Dan saya nampak ada penambahbaikan bila dia letakkan domain-domain yang banyak dan cikgu-cikgu boleh pilih untuk kekalkan yang mana. Nak tumpukan dia pada yang mana. Saya rasa itu yang terbaik kerana macam saya sebut tadi, adakah kita nak tengok kan? Kita kena berbalik kepada asalnya. Kenapa kita mentaksir murid berkeperluan khas kita, berkeperluan pendidikan khas kita? Kenapa? Untuk apa kan? So kalau just nak bagi dia pandai akademik, tak semua yang akan menjurus sampai ke situ. So mana kita nak tumpukan? Skills lah kan? Seeloknya lah. Tapi macam saya sebut, kita tak boleh nak abaikan dia punya akademik dia. Tapi bila akademik dia dah okey, kita boleh masukkan dia ke inklusif pula kan, untuk dia dapatkan pentaksiran yang lebih baik lah. Kemudian yang keempat adalah kognitif function, dia punya keupayaan kognitif dia. Ini pun jadi satu perkara yang guru-guru di sekolah minta saya sampaikan juga, ialah academically okey, tetapi kalau yang pelajar kita yang kepusian rendah kan. Dulu kita dah ada PASR sebelum ni, tapi di sekolah rendah kan. Tapi tiba-tiba kita dah batalkan atau ketukar kan sebagainya. So dia jadi, tapi sebenarnya itu bagus macam PSM sekarang ni. It's good untuk, ianya adil. Kan adil. Kena kita kata murid tipikal satu orang, murid khas. Kan orang secara basicnya dia akan tengok yang tipikal ni. Hebatnya dia, tapi murid kita ni orang akan tengok macam okey, pendidikan khas. Tapi sebenarnya bila kita mentaksir dia kan, certain perkara dia lebih baik daripada typical student. Kan contohnya dalam kemandirian dia, silat-silat bagi bulan, murid kita ni lagi pandai cuci baju, basuh baju daripada murid tipikal yang hebat daripada akademik. Kan? So ada certain. So saya sangat bertuah lah kerana bila saya terlibat dalam PSM tu, saya nampak dia punya idea, dia punya cara pelaksanaan itu adalah adil kepada murid kita. Dulu katanya sebelum tu tak banyak macam tu domainnya. And then tahun lepas dia tambahkan untuk kita mantapkan lagi. Dulu berkaitan cognitive function ni, di sekolah saya, di sekolah kedua saya selepas saya posting, sekolah kedua saya berpindah, sekolah kedua saya diperkenalkan satu program. Dia panggil tapi banyaklah sekarang ni buat, dipanggil rumah olok-olok, mock house. Kan? Saya nak bagi kredit lah dekat guru besar saya pada waktu itu. Dia buat mock house ni, dia sediakan dua blok bangunan, dua blok tu. Dia susun atur dalam bangunan tu sebiji macam dekat rumah. Ada bilik tidur, ada toilet, ada tempat basuh baju, ada tempat sidai baju dekat luar, dan juga ada kebun kat luar tu untuk tanam cili dan juga serai. Dan ada ruang tamu dan juga ada dapur untuk memasak. Jadi murid-murid ni dibahagikan kepada beberapa kumpulan di mana setiap kumpulan itu, kumpulan 1 3 bulan ni dekat dapur. Kumpulan 2 3 bulan ni dekat toilet. Kumpulan 3 bulan ni dekat ruang tamu. Dan kumpulan 4 dekat dobi, baju, dan kumpulan 1 lagi buat kerja-kerja dekat luar. And then selepas 3 bulan rotate, bertukar. Kan? So kita dalam masa yang sama, walaupun dia basuh baju ni, tapi akademik kita masukkan juga untuk kita nak selitkan pada dia tentang akademik tu sendiri. Bagaimana nak kira. Sebab bila kita buat dobi kat situ, kita dah open. Siapa-siapa yang nak hantar baju, boleh hantar baju untuk dibasuh dengan bayaran tertentu. So daripada situ murid tu dah belajar untuk mengira, belajar jual beli dan sebagainya, dan kita taksir. Di situlah. So saya rasa benda tu lebih bermakna dan lebih adil kepada murid kita lah. So bila kita sebut tentang kecukupan itu yang sepatutnya lah. Dan seterusnya juga, bila kita nak mentaksir tu cukup atau sesuainya atau tidak, of course pertama tadi berkaitan ketidakupayaan dia kan. Kemudian cara dia belajar dan juga dia bersedia atau tidak bersedia. Kan yang datang dalam kelas kita tu macam-macam background dan macam-macam ketidakupayaan. Adakah kita nak menilai dia sama saja? Adakah nak mentaksir dia sama saja? Kan? So ada caranya sendiri. Dan juga ada guru-guru bagi tahu saya lah, rakan-rakan guru, dia kata once kita nak buat ni, sebab ada kadang-kadang di sekolah ni dia terpaksa macam you punya murid you kena juga bagi dia lepas, something macam tu kan. So terpaksa situ. So at least sebenarnya kita kalau nak buat pentaksiran ni biar lengkap daripada we start from RPI kan. So RPI, apa yang ada RPI itu kita rancang, kemudian kita buat intervensi kepada dia, dan last sekali kita taksir. Ada pelajar pendengaran kat belakang. Assalamualaikum. Ingat tadi tak ada. Okey. So ada dia punya terms dia. Kadang-kadang kita tak buat RPI intervensi, tapi kita tiba-tiba kita taksir. So dia jadi tidak adil kepada murid kita. Kan? So buat RPI, buat cantik-cantik berdasarkan kepada dia. Jangan kita rasa tak perlu RPI kan. So RPI itu pada asasnya satu yang perlu sehingga kita nak taksir dia dengan betul. Dan yang keduanya, ada juga yang bagi tahu, ada berkongsi dengan saya lah berkaitan dengan PBS, berdasarkan sekolah sekarang ini, adakah bersesuaian dengan apa yang murid kita perlu, ataupun adakah penilaian pentaksiran itu hanya dia jadi macam luas, tidak memberi makna kepada pelajar kita. Kan? So kita ada PBD, kita ada psikometri, kita ada PAJSK, kan? Adakah itu, kadang-kadang penilaian tu dia nampak macam terlalu akademik, dan juga ada juga yang nampak terlalu perdana kan kepada ni. So kita nak kena tengok baliklah perkara tu. Dan juga seterusnya adalah berlaku atau tidak pertindihan, kan? Pelajar dah ada nilai. Kemudian ada pula pentaksiran lain yang mentaksir pula murid kita. Ada juga yang guru-guru yang berkongsi dengan saya macam tu. Dia dah buat pentaksiran ini, tapi dalam masa yang sama dia nak kena mentaksir pula lagi satu. Yang ini berlaku di sekolah menengah lah, banyak sangat. Kan? Yang mula-mula kena pentaksiran PBD lah. Kemudian ada pentaksiran lain lagi, saya pun tak pasti. So banyak, menyebabkan benda tu, itulah saya kata tadi, dia jadi keterpaksaan. Bila banyak sangat, dia jadi keterpaksaan. Okay, tapi nak atau tidak, kita sebagai cikgu kan, kita buat juga. Kan? Rakan-rakan guru yang saya kenali, yang saya jumpa memang committed untuk sediakan pentaksiran tersebut lah. Okey, seterusnya. Okey, ni sama juga apa yang saya sebut tadi. Macam mana nak cukup? apa yang sesuai, saya besarkan sikit skill tu, saya kecilkan sikit akademik. Sebab pada saya skills tu untuk murid kita lebih adil bagi dia lah. Akademik tu utamanya masalah pembelajaran kan. Akan berlakulah sedikit masalah, macam mana kita nak menilai. Boleh menilai tapi bukan tumpuan. Macam saya sebut tadi, kita selitkan. Kita buat kemahiran tapi dalam tu kita selitkan. Saya pernah buat dulu dia nak dalam mock house tadi, tempat dia duduk di ruang bilik tidur. So kemahiran yang kita ajar pada dia, kita nak taksir dia boleh tak pasang cadar kan dan sebagainya. Tapi dalam masa yang sama kita introduce dia juga tentang akademik. Okay, ejaan ke, buat ayat ke berkaitan dengan akademik lah. So barulah berlaku pentaksiran. Sengaja saya besarkan pada skill supaya adil lah. Kan? Kadang-kadang orang nak tengok juga akademik. Memanglah untuk akademik untuk murid tipikal okey, tetapi untuk akademik bagi murid berkumpulan pendidikan khas ni kita kena janganlah buang terus, jangan buang terus, tapi kena ada. Okey, ini yang saya sebutkan tadi kan, mock house bawah tu. Satu lagi, bila sebut pentaksiran, yang menjadi satu lagi tanda tanya lah dan juga boleh dibincangkan adalah pentaksiran bagi MBPK yang berada dalam kelas program pendidikan inklusif, PPI. Okey, saya tak pasti sekarang ni bagaimana MBPK yang PPI ini ditaksir. Adakah sama dengan murid tipikal lain dalam kelas tersebut ataupun dia ada satu pentaksiran lain untuk mentaksirkan dia. Okey, itu boleh dibincangkanlah. Dan saya rasa bila kita dah sampai ke inklusif, maksudnya murid kita tu dah ada satu kebolehfungsian dia yang agak tinggi. Sebab tu kita masuk dalam inklusif. Dan kalaulah ditaksir mengikut apa yang murid tipikal lain ditaksir dalam inklusif tersebut, bagi saya it's okay lah nak menunjukkan murid kita tu yalah high standard dia, sebab dia masuk PPI. Tetapi perlu adil juga bagi dia. Sebelum kita nak taksir mengikut sama dengan tipikal tersebut, cukup tak dia punya resource dia kan, cukup tak bantuan yang kita bagi, cukup tak facility yang kita provide kan. And then baru kita boleh sama standardkan dengan murid tipikal yang lain. Okey. Kemudian itu saja. Okey Okey, baik. Jadi saya tak tahulah masanya dah cukup ke belum. Kalau bagi masa lagi saya akan cakap lagi. Okey, secara kesimpulannya bila disebut pentaksiran untuk murid berkeperluan pendidikan khas, pertamanya berlakulah adil pada setiap kebolehan dan ketidakupayaan yang mereka ada. Okey, murid-murid kita ada ketidakupayaan, tetapi dalam masa yang sama dia ada kebolehan yang lain. Jadi bila nak mentaksir, tengok semua benda dan pastikan pentaksiran kita itu adil bagi dia dan apa yang dia perlu. Kan? Kita dah tentukan domain apa yang kita nak fokuskan dan taksirlah dia dengan sebaik mungkin, dan kemungkinan nanti kita ke arah itu. Bila pentaksiran ini keluar, mungkin majikan akan berpandukan kepada kita punya pentaksiran tadi untuk dia serapkan murid-murid kita ni ke alam pekerjaan lah. Itulah yang kita punya aim pun kan. Satunya nak boleh dia berdikari, yang keduanya nak boleh dia bekerja. Kita ada lagi tak apa, mak dengan ayah ada lagi tak apa, tapi bila satu masa mak dengan ayahnya dah tak ada, so how dia nak teruskan kehidupan dia dan bagaimana dia nak berkejaya selepas itu. Jadi yang pertamanya adil menyeluruh, yang keduanya mentaksirlah daripada hati nurani. Kan kalau dia tak boleh lah. Kalau dia boleh buat taksir, dia boleh. Kadang-kadang kita rasa macam alah tak boleh, tapi bagi boleh jugalah. Sebabnya nanti tak cantik keputusannya kan. So bagi boleh juga. So dia jadi macam bukan datang daripada yang hati kita dan juga bukan datang daripada keadaan sebenar, menjadikan kita sebenarnya membuatkan murid kita tadi itu yang mungkin akan tak adil dan juga akan rosakkanlah dia punya keupayaan dia. So taksir daripada hati, kalau boleh cakap boleh, kalau tak boleh cakap tak boleh. Kan? Saya dulu kat sekolah tak berani cakap macam ni. Kan? Bila sampai ke sini je. Kan? So tapi betul lah kalau dia tak boleh, jangan kita kata dia boleh. Dan bila nak buat RPI untuk dia pun, sebab RPI itu akan bersambung-sambung sehingga pentaksiran. Tetapkanlah RPI itu yang sesuai yang mungkin. Bukan kita kata macam, murid ni, cikgu ni dah buat yang ni untuk murid dia kan, aku nak buat up lagi sikit kan. So akhirnya kita mentaksir yang tidak adil, kita mentaksir secara salah dan membuatkan produk murid kita tu yang keluar tu sebenarnya bukan apa yang sebenarnya yang dia ada. Okey? So saya mengharapkan saya dia macam kecil je kat sini, tapi anda semua adalah lebih besar dan lebih berpengalaman daripada saya, dan yang membezakan kita pada hari ini adalah saya kat depan, anda semua kat bawah, kat depan saya, itu saja. Yang lain semua pengalaman lebih hebat. Tu bila orang jumpa saya dia kata, doktor saya nak dapatkan kesahan pakar lah untuk saya punya kajian ni. Saya kata boleh, tetapi pakar sebenarnya adalah yang berada di sekolah. Awak pergi ke sekolah, tanya cikgu-cikgu sama ada kajian awak ini sebenarnya reliable atau tidak. Pergi ke sana. Dia kata saya syaratnya dapat daripada yang pensyarah ataupun PhD. Saya kata ya betul. Secara akademiknya ya. Tapi untuk betul-betul you faham, saya cakap kat student saya lah, betul-betul you nak faham apa yang berlaku, betul-betul nak tahu sebenarnya boleh tak boleh kajian ni, you kena turun ke sekolah berjumpa dengan cikgu-cikgu. Kerana pakar sebenar adalah cikgu-cikgu yang ada di sekolah. Sebabnya dia macam, kalau bidang lain, industri dia mungkin kilang, company dan sebagainya. Tapi kalau kita, pendidikan, industri sebenar kita adalah di sekolah. So kalau you know apa benda yang you rasa macam you perlu, pergi ke sekolah, jumpa murid-murid dan jumpa cikgu-cikgu yang memang akan memberikan banyak input kepada awak lah. Dan saya tak menafikan lah, bila saya bertanya cikgu, satu soalan je saya tanya, tapi dia punya jawapan tu, sampai saya rasa macam saya tak tahu apa-apa. Kan? Jawapan dia kena ni. Saya kata, oh macam tu Oh ya ke? Sebab saya duduk kat sekolah pun 10 tahun kan, saya rasa macam macam saya tak tahu apa-apa dah. Banyak sangat perubahan berlaku dan banyak sangat sebenarnya input yang berada di sekolah yang kita kena tengok lagi. Pergi lagi. Kadang-kadang kita rasa macam dah okey. Kan? Kita macam saya duduk kat universiti, saya rasa macam ya ke? Nothing, okey je. Kan? Tapi bila masuk bertanya dengan cikgu-cikgu, kita nampak kan banyak benda yang sebenarnya bukannya tak bagus, dah berlaku dah. Cuma ada kemaskini yang boleh kita lakukan untuk kebaikan bukan orang lain, untuk kebaikan MBBK kita juga. Kalau kita tak bantu, siapa nak bantu dia orang? Kan? Mereka nak bantu diri mereka sendiri sedikit boleh. Tapi orang lain, ibu bapa dan juga guru lah yang memegang peranan penting dalam memberikan penaksiran dan juga penilaian yang terbaik sesuai dan adil kepada MBPK pendidikan khas kita, insyaAllah. Jadi saya rasa itu saja. Terima kasih saya ucapkan sekali lagi kepada semua yang hadir, dan terima kasih juga kepada Lembaga Periksaan atas jemputan ini. Dan saya sudahi dengan pendidikan khas sentiasa istimewa. Sekiranya kita perlu 100 tahun untuk berada dalam pendidikan khas, beradalah dalam pendidikan khas ini 200 tahun. Kalau kita rasa kita perlu sayang pendidikan khas ini 100%, sayanglah pendidikan khas ini 200%. InsyaAllah. Jadi wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh. Terima kasih.
Majlis merakamkan ucapan terima kasih atas kesudian yang berusaha Dr. Muhammad Norazmi bin Nordin menyampaikan sesi pembentangan beliau di InCoSSAA 2023 sebentar tadi. Semoga apa yang telah dinyatakan memberikan sedikit suntikan semangat kepada semua guru-guru, terutamanya guru-guru PPKI yang terus cekal dan sabar. Berikan satu tepukan gemuruh buat semua guru-guru PPKI yang ada di Malaysia ini. Hadirin sekalian, persidangan kita pada pagi ini akan diteruskan dengan sesi Ucaptama kedua. Saya akan menyerahkan pentas pengacaraan ini kepada sahabat saya untuk meneruskan agenda persidangan seterusnya. Over to you, Ms. Sufina Halim. The floor is all yours. Thank you. Baiklah, untuk sesi Ucaptama yang kedua ni kita ada pembentang daripada luar negara iaitu daripada Australia. Jadi kita sedang dalam proses untuk connecting dengan dia. Jadi kita minta hadirin semua untuk terus kekal. Once ready kita akan terus bersiaran. Ya.
Mic test, mic test. Doctors, is the voice clear? Good. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and a very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The Malaysian Examination Syndicate orchestrates InCoSSAA 2023 to unite educators, ministries, and agencies to elevate special education and encourage innovation in ensuring equal recognition for individuals with disabilities through inclusive discussions on alternative assessment. And what better way to achieve these objectives than to enlighten the participants of InCoSSAA 2023 with the international experience in the assessment of special education needs. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our international speaker who is joining us online from the University of Sydney, Australia. She obtained her Master of Education in Special Education from the University of Sydney in 2003, and 2 years later received her Graduate Certificate in Autism Spectrum Disorder from Queensland University of Technology. Awarded with Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Sydney in 2015, and last year she received another graduate certificate, this time in Applied Mental Health by NSW Health Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to invite our international speaker from Australia, the Senior Lecturer in Special Education, the Executive Director of Initial Teacher Education, School of Education and Social Work, the University of Sydney. Please welcome Dr. Cathy Little. We can't hear you at the moment, Doctor. Give us a second, yeah? Okay, we have probably rectified the problem, Doctor. Can you please say something? We are trying to get your voice to be heard. Oh, okay, now everything is clear. Yes, we can. Yes, we can see the presentation.
And we'll get going.
Yes, yes, please. Over to you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you for the very kind invitation and the very warm welcome that my colleague and I have received from all of you in Malaysia and the invitation to present at this conference. I would like to take this moment to introduce my colleague, Professor David Evans, who is also part of the Special and Inclusive Education team at the University of Sydney in the Sydney School of Education and Social Work. And Professor Evans and I work quite closely in the area of special and inclusive education, and his expertise around curriculum and assessment is something that I think you will find very valuable to today's presentation. Thank you. David has control of the slides, so I'm just going to acknowledge him every so often to get him to move on to the next slide. So, as is customary in Australia, we, in any setting and before any meeting or presentation, we always pay acknowledgement and respects to the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet. And Professor Evans and I are sitting on different lands at the moment, but collectively we would like to recognise and pay respects to the elders and communities of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations people, both past, present and emerging, across all of the lands of our wonderful country, and particularly those lands that the University of Sydney's campuses stand upon. For thousands of years, our First Nations people have shared and exchanged their knowledge across a range of generations for the benefit of us all. And it is very important for us to acknowledge that contribution to learning, and it's very important for us to recognise the ongoing contribution to our country and to the way we are developing. It's a very important time for us in Australia with our voice referendum. And so we always like to pay acknowledgement to the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet. Thank you, David. So just very briefly, as our lovely colleague introduced us, Professor David Evans is the Professor of Special and Inclusive Education at the University of Sydney. I'm the Chair of Initial Teacher Education in the Sydney School of Education and Social Work and a Senior Lecturer in Special Education. David and I both come to our teaching at university with, I hate to think how many years combined experience, David, a lot. We are both primary teachers by trade, but fell into the area of special education, and once we were in there, we never left. It's an amazing opportunity for us to be able to continue to work in that space and to be able to continue to support the ongoing authentic participation and engagement in education for our students with disability. Thank you, David. So very quickly, what we're going to try and cover in the next 45 minutes or so is just a very brief touch on what we believe is assessment and the role of assessment in the learning of students with disability. David will share with you his extensive expertise around the Australian curriculum and how that lends a very strong foundation and framework around the use of assessment, not just for students with disability, but for all students. And then finally finish off with the connection between assessment, planning and reporting, both to students and to families. So by way of some context, and this seems a little, I suppose, patronising to you, but it's important for you to understand that in Australia, we are one country, but we are constituted of six states and 2 territories. And I'm going to come back to this map shortly, and you'll understand why I've explained this and included this in the presentation. Thanks, David. Across Australia, we have a large population, but that population is condensed into a very small component of our land area. 80% of our population live in that narrow coastal stretch from Brisbane around to Adelaide, encompassing Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and a very small part of South Australia. which is only 3% of our land area, but 80% of our people live there. So this has significant implications in terms of education, the service provision that is provided to all students, not just students with disability. But when we think about 97% of our land is not, I suppose, people don't live primarily in the bulk of the land, but you can see there is a significant population density spread throughout. So the service provision for our children and young people with disability who live in rural and remote areas of the country, who live outside of that very narrow coastal strip, it's quite concerning about the education provision that is sometimes afforded to them. We have a number of children across the country who attend School of the Air because they live in such remote locations, they don't physically attend school. So you can imagine some of the challenges that this might pose if you have a child or children with disability who require some specialised or intensive interventions, and in terms of their education and in terms indeed of how we assess them as part of their education. Thank you, David. So across Australia, we have 3 layers of government that oversee our education and service provision. We have our Commonwealth or national systems of legislation and policy, which sit beneath we are a signatory to the UN Convention on Rights of Persons with a Disability, and General Comment number 4, we observe those conventions across the country. And then we have a range of legislation and policy which impacts directly on education provision for students with disability and students without disability. We hold true to the Disability Discrimination Act, which covers education, health, employment, transport, living, accommodation, which says that you cannot discriminate against a person or a child simply because of their disability. Part of the Disability Discrimination Act, which focuses specifically around education, is called the Disability Standards for Education, which were developed and released in 2005. These standards focus specifically on educational provision for students with disability and how you cannot discriminate against a child or an affiliate of the child, so a parent or a carer, as a result of disability. This is the law, this is the legislation that every educational service provider in our country must adhere to and reflect in their operational practice. We also are informed by our national policy, by which you can see there, the most prominent of those is our Education Declaration, and the most recent of those is in 2019 in Alice Springs, the Impantwe Declaration, which states quite clearly that as education providers, we must in Australia provide an education that is equitable, inclusive and free from discrimination for every child. Not some, not most, but every child has the right to access a quality, inclusive, authentic education. We have a range of other policies that influence what we do in education. Some of those include our National School Reforms Agreement, the Australian Curriculum, which David will talk more about, the nationally consistent collection of data on school students with disability, which is very heavily invested in assessment to provide adjustments to learning, adjustments to the environment, to ensure that our students with disability can engage and participate in education. And then we have our Australian Professional Standards for Teachers, which says that as a teacher, I'm accredited and I recognise 7 particular graduate teacher standards that include specific address for the needs of students with disability. So remember I said we have 6 states and 2 territories within our continent of Australia. That is important because every state and territory has its own education department. So we have an overarching Commonwealth department, but beneath that sits individual state and territory education departments. And those departments enact further policy and further legislation to inform the inclusive practices for students with disability in schools. Some of those are listed here. We have a range of developments that cover curriculum, the living document around the disability strategy, the inclusive education statement for students with disability, our high potential and gifted education, and our student behaviour strategy. Schools are then the third layer of implementation for students with disability. They respond to a statewide school excellence in action plan to develop a specific school plan for their school. And then within classrooms, individual teachers plan for personalised learning and support. And as I said, the NCCD, the Nationally Consistent Collection of Data, relies heavily on assessment of student engagement, student participation and student learning to inform the kinds of adjustments that are required for that student to access and participate. Thank you, David. Here is some data, and I'm hoping that you will be able to access these slides later. I don't want to read through these. That this data just shares with you the schools across Australia. We have what are normally considered primary schools, which are from usually kindergarten, aged 5 or 6, through to year 6, which is ages 11 or 12. Then we have our secondary schools, which are ages 13 through to 18. We have some kindergarten to year 12 schools, which are combined schools. And across the country, we also have what are considered special schools. And these are schools for students with complex or high support needs, or our students with quite challenging emotional or behaviour disorder. The majority of our schools across the country are government owned and managed. So almost 70% of our schools are owned and managed by our state government systems. We have just over, at the moment, 4 million students enrolled in education, with the bulk of those 2.6 million enrolled in our public or government schools. And it is our government schools, our public schools, that hold the higher proportion of students from selected equity groups. So most of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students attend public education. Most of our students from low socioeconomic background attend public education. And the bulk of our students with disability are enrolled in our public school sector. Thank you, David. As I said, we'll just gloss over this. Each of the 6 states and territories has its own Department of Education, so it develops its own policies and procedures surrounding education. Each state government provides the funding to the education sectors and providers. This is in addition to the federal funding that's provided by the Australian government. But it is our state-based organisations that determine the implementation of curriculum, that register our schools, and that are directly responsible for the school administration. Thank you, David. As I said, I've already touched on this. This was the goals from the Alice Springs Declaration in 2019. What's important for us is this notion that all young Australians are provided with access to high quality education that is inclusive and free, that education is seen as being a pathway to successful lifelong learning and successful quality of life for every child, and that it is through education that we develop the advocacy and self-determination that is so required for our young people with disability to become active and informed members of our community. Thank you, David. So when we think about assessment within our school learning cycle, we know that assessment is the gathering of evidence. We now in education in New South Wales particularly talk about assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning. We focus around assessment very purposefully and intentionally, that it is part of an intrinsic cycle of learning. It involves our students. We particularly get our teachers to think about assessment for learning with those diagnostics. What am I planning? What am I teaching? Where are my students going? But we very much draw our students into the assessment process when we're saying, this is assessment as learning. What are you learning? How are you learning? How can I, as the teacher, respond to your learning needs? And we do that through this, what used to be formative assessment, but we now use it assessment as learning. And we provide our students with opportunities to demonstrate their learning through assessment of learning. We use the principles and draw on the principles of universal design for learning to provide our students with multiple opportunities to showcase their learning in very different ways. And particularly for our students with disability, our more traditional evidences of learning, those more traditional summative evidences of learning, are becoming, I suppose, more flexible in their design. We're no longer expecting our students to conform to more traditional experiences of assessment, the more pencil paper tasks. We are using much more, I suppose, rigorous but flexible ways for our students to demonstrate their learning. And David will talk more about that in future slides. Thanks, David. I think we can move on past that one. Thank you, David. Finally, our graduate teacher standards, which our teachers and our initial teacher education students must respond to, highlights very clearly the role of assessment and purposeful assessment for teachers and thinking about teaching. We look at this through how we ask our teachers to showcase evidence in their planning for effective teaching and learning for every student, and specific address of assessment in Standard 5, which says, how do you assess as a teacher for every student? How do you provide feedback? What are the multiple ways you use feedback for students, with students, to engage in their learning? And how do you report to students? How do you report to their families about the learning process? Thank you, David. All right, I'll hand over to David now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Cathy. So I want to follow on from Cathy's introduction there and I suppose primarily talk about assessment at the bigger picture level. So the Australian curriculum was came into being around about 2010 as part of a comprehensive strategy, national strategy around disability. It was part of that development. And it was very, very clear from the beginning that all students can learn, every student mattered, and that all young Australians will be part of this new curriculum. And that in itself created its own, I suppose, challenges. And I firmly believe that they were exciting challenges for us to grapple with. And I was fortunate to be involved in some of the discussion around this area. So as Cathy has said, education is for all young Australians, and that we will provide a quality education for every student. The Australian curriculum is made up of 3 core areas, and I'm focusing on the curriculum because when it comes to assessment, the curriculum becomes a key point of decision making. It is an element of education against which student performance is often judged, and it is often a reflection of the health of the education sectors. The Australian curriculum is made up of 3 key areas. It's a multi-dimensional curriculum. And while it's represented there as 3 equal representations, the idea is that those 3 areas, A, interact, and B, that you can actually change the focus and change the weighting of those areas. For many students, it's going to be quite equal. We're going to have our learning areas or content. We're going to have our general capabilities, things like literacy and numeracy, and personal and social capabilities, ICT, ethical behaviours, all of those 21st century learning skills. Now, many of those skills are critically important, especially for our students with disabilities, students with complex educational needs, who require those skills to become independent members of or contributing members of our society, to be able to make decisions for themselves and to determine their future. For those students, then, we may increase the proportion of the general capabilities, for example, and restrict or reduce the amount of content that we're trying to cover, the level of content we're trying to cover, and the areas within the cross-curriculum priorities. And this flexibility within the curriculum has implications for assessment, because a one-size-fits-all assessment process is going to be difficult to implement if we want to actually assess student learning and to make judgments about the health of our education sector. There was a comment made by our distinguished MC about Malaysia wanting to develop innovative approaches to assessment. This sort of challenge that is facing teachers here in Australia, I think, lends itself to that sense of innovation. Cathy said, while there's an Australian education department, states and territories are responsible for the implementation of the Australian curriculum. And that is where we start to get some, further challenges. For example, not all states and territories use the Australian curriculum in that flexible three-dimensional sort of approach. In New South Wales, it tends to be far more one-dimensional around curriculum, with the cross-curriculum priorities and general capabilities popped into it or inserted into it. The ability to be flexible with general capabilities, for example, is not quite as robust as it was in the Australian, as it was originally designed. The other thing about New South Wales is, for students with disabilities, there is a life skills syllabus, a separate parallel curriculum or syllabus for students with disabilities to access, in particular years 7 to 12. That poses another sort of challenge when it comes to assessment. Other states and territories use a range of different ways of interpreting the curriculum. Victoria, for example, developed what is known to a set of prior to foundation statements. And the same argument is for the life skills syllabus in New South Wales, I see that as a very much a lowering of expectations and leads to not quite as robust learning environments for our students. But in each of these areas, assessment is really important, and how we assess students with disabilities becomes a real challenge. Our major national assessment program, NAPLAN, measures or is an approach to looking at literacy and numeracy. And literacy and numeracy are the key areas, while there are, for example, science, for example, is one area that gets covered. It's a nationwide measure through which parents, carers, teachers, schools, education authorities, governments and the broader community can determine whether or not young Australians are developing the literacy skill and numeracy skills that provide a critical foundation for other learning. And this sort of area is really, really important, not only for students without disability, but it's really important for students with disabilities. And the challenge we face here is that we tend to have a one-size-fits-all sort of approach to this, in the sense of it's an assessment program that, while it has certain degrees of flexibility in it and it makes adjustments for many students with disabilities, it is not an assessment program that is genuinely able to be accessed and for all of our learners to participate in. And that is a challenge. The way around it has been, first of all, to provide exemption for students with disabilities, especially students whose disability severely limits their capacity to participate in assessment. That is, the assessment that has been designed. I would argue that these group of students are being disabled by the assessment process. But that's another conversation. So some students are granted formal exemption, and as a result, those students tend not to have their learning reviewed like other students. Are we getting value for money in terms of the budget we spend on education? Are we developing the skills within these learners to ensure that they do have that critical foundation for other learning? ACARA has taken this position and allocated or devolved the responsibility for assessment to states and territories. And that has created in itself further debate. In the state of Victoria, for example, the claim is that exempting students with disabilities not only hinders our ability to see whether this funding is effective, it is likely to impact a student's academic motivation by emphasising their impairment over the capacity to learn. It's a position that makes, I suppose, an assumption that students with disability, especially students with complex disability, do not learn or cannot learn. And there are reports where those sorts of statements are being made. Whereas it could be seen as an opportunity to be innovative and creative in the way that we assess students. In my home state of New South Wales, another comment made by our Auditor General was that it's not possible to determine overall school performance in improving the learning outcomes of students with disability, primarily because they're not included in our national assessment. Our national assessment is not strong enough in terms of assessment to capture their learning, and further, assessment protocols at the state level, again, not robust enough to capture the learning of students with disabilities. So in your conversations in this conference, I challenge you to have or to create assessment protocols that allow students with disability to be included. And we collect a lot of data about students with disabilities. Dr. Little made comment around the nationally consistent collection of data. The NCCD is a data gathering process. It tells us how many are the proportion of students with disabilities in our schools and the level of support that they are receiving in terms of a reasonable adjustment. Impact on their learning, however, is not part of this process. Data collection and assessment and collecting evidence around student learning is important, but it is not used to examine, for example, the impact of the support, both personnel and financial, that is provided through this NCCD collection of data. An alternate for me is to use this mechanism of collecting evidence around the levels of adjustment that students with disability receive to build stronger educational environments, to use it as a mechanism to make judgments about how well are we designing adjustments and how well are we, or what value are we getting for the support, the financial and the personnel support that we're providing to schools. It's an opportunity to involve persons with disability. Something, again, I challenge you in terms of creating assessments that are inclusive of students with disability, is to make sure that they are part of the discussion. Cathy's talked to some length about assessments and in schools and in classrooms. And she talked about, assessment for learning, assessment of learning. We collect a lot of data about our students. In the disability area, for example, in the NCCD, we collect a lot of evidence about the type of support that we provide students and the level of support that we provide students. But we often leave out important people. Class teachers, for example, in the work that I have done, are not part of this. They are collecting evidence all the time, a range of evidence. Learners are often not involved. Parents and carers are not often involved. It's a group of people who are making decisions for students and for teachers. I encourage you to think about how you involve everybody in the decision-making process, in the data collection decision-making process, what that data means and what it means in regards to the efficacy and the impact of education. So how do we make better use of the data we collect? How do we make better use of the opportunities to assess and inform quality outcomes for all learners, in particular students with special education needs? I want to put to you that learning is across curriculum areas as a continuum. We often see curriculum as being a year level and having compartments or silos of content. We need to see curriculum areas as a continuum. And as such, we need to be making decisions along this continuum, and we need to be using different forms of assessment and data collection along a continuum. We can go from very unstructured chance meetings, conversations, through questionnaires, observations. Teachers are always making observations. Involve students in self-assessment, self-evaluation, self-monitoring of their learning, through to more structured sort of forms of assessment. Classroom tests, they can be quite formal, but they can also be quite exclusionary. Will they involve all of our learners? Checklists may be something a little bit more flexible. Practical work, project work, through to examinations, standardised tests and published aptitude tests. Now, can I say to you that most structured part, where we tend to have high reliability and high validity, and we have normative standardised processes, in many cases they exclude students with disabilities, because the way that they're delivered and the way that the expectation of their delivery excludes students. So being able to use maybe less structured, slightly structured assessments becomes important. As Cathy said, assessment, planning and reporting is a real basis, a really important cycle. We need assessment to establish strengths of our students. And again, in terms of students with disabilities, I encourage you to think about identifying strengths and using those strengths to plan and report. But we need to be able to have a flexible curriculum. And I'm very aware that in Malaysia you do have a multi-dimensional approach to your curriculum. This cycle asks teachers to consider current knowledge, strengths, the content areas students are to learn, content areas that students would really like to learn. So what is going to be motivating and interesting for them? Thinking about how students learn the content, talking to our students about how they're going to learn content. Have this as part of our assessment, planning and reporting, and how learning will be assessed. How will students be given opportunities to show their learning? Will it be in one way or will it be in multiple ways? The Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, ACARA, has an assessment, planning and reporting for diversity component. It's captured within this acronym of CASE: curriculum, abilities, standards and evaluate. We have a curriculum. We can personalise that curriculum to individuals, personalise it for students with disabilities, for example. We can look at the strengths that those students bring to the context. It requires assessment. We look at the standards we want students to achieve. How can we access those standards and allow students to demonstrate their learning against these standards? Again, it requires assessment. It requires flexible assessment, different ways of students being able to represent their learning. And then we evaluate against those. So in this case, if we take the flexible dimension or the flexibility of the Australian curriculum, and we make sure all students access, participate and learn from the same curriculum, that is a fundamental of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, persons with disabilities, for example. I know Malaysia is a signatory to that convention, but to me it is a fundamental basis for all students that they learn from the same curriculum. That all students access, participate and learn from the same curriculum requires collaboration on meaningful and personalised learning. How do we use this flexible curriculum to develop a rich learning experience for our students? And then how do we assess the richness of that? Having a pencil and paper test may not capture that. I mean, may need to be observing students, getting students to self-assess, getting students to represent their learning in a range of ways, giving them a range of ways. I can also sequence and segment the curriculum. I can modify the amount of curriculum that students are going to be working through. In some cases, you might reduce the content, but increase the general capabilities. Interests, motivation and strengths of a student need to be taken into consideration as part of this. And all through this, we're thinking of a flexible approaches to assessment as part of the process. So I come back to this, that curriculum design must be flexible. As part of curriculum design, we need to have flexibility in what students are working towards, because our students come to us with a diversity of backgrounds. No two students are the same. So having the same curriculum for a whole range of students is problematic. We need to make sure that our standards are flexible enough and open enough for students to work towards the standards in a way that demonstrates their learning and represents their strengths, and then we can evaluate against that. Access to making sure that our curriculum is flexible, and making sure that we see the curriculum in a way that allows students, especially students with disabilities who may have quite unique needs, to enter at a point that allows them to demonstrate their strengths while also accessing a robust curriculum on the same basis as students without disabilities. For example, I remember watching a wonderful classroom teacher working with students with quite complex needs. They were Year 9 students and they were doing probability. Now, I've given this example to other teachers and they've said, but why are they doing probability? Well, probability is the content. It's the learning area. The focus was around the general capabilities. It was around how they could make judgments about what pins in a bowling alley, so they were in a bowling, they'd set up their own little bowling alley, would be knocked down. And the pins were of different colours. There were lots of red ones, but only some blue ones. So what was the likelihood that they were going to hit a red one or a blue one? And they could use their communication, their literacy, to report on this. The teacher, while using probability as the content, was actually focusing on the personal needs of these students around communication and literacy, around numeracy. There was lots of numeracy going on here. Right? Are there more red or are there more blue? They could be doing small quantities of counting. Really important for these students who are going to go on beyond school into jobs. So education for all, I'll come back to this quote, but I would like you to focus on the representation below. all of our students are different. Having the same curriculum for all students is going to be problematic. Having the same assessments for all students is going to be problematic. If we tailor our assessments and tailor our curriculum to the needs of our students, especially our students with disabilities, we are more likely to get rich evidence of their learning and of the benefits that our education systems are providing those students. Education is for all students, and it is for all young Australians, as it is for all young Malaysians. In closing, though, I just want to make a couple of comments about a report that was handed down 1 week ago today, the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of Persons with Disability. One of the comments, or two of the comments made in this report are that we need to adapt the curriculum and teaching and assessment practices to enable diverse learners, especially those with complex communicational support needs, to participate in learning experiences on the same basis as students without disability. The Royal Commission has called out that our meeting these expectations may not be as strong as we would like, and we have a lot to do with our teachers. Cathy, in her role as Director of Initial Teacher Education, I know this is important to her, but making sure that all of our teachers are well versed in how they design curriculum, how they design teaching, and how they assess students needs to be inclusive of all learners. And in terms of our national literacy and numeracy assessment program, there is a call for our states and territories to make sure that we have a data collection system that allows students with disabilities to participate. We need to be innovative, we need to be creative, so that we can make robust judgments about the quality of the education that they provide. So in conclusion, I think Cathy and I have tried to say, what is the purpose of assessment? Is it national testing? Is it system level testing? Is it classroom teaching? Is it testing or assessment? Is it assessment that's going to make judgment about an individual's personal learning achievements? Making sure that we have links to curriculum and personal needs of our learners, especially when we're talking about students with disabilities. It's part of personal goals that you might be setting for them. How will you collect that information? Are you going to do a one-size-fits-all, everybody has to fit into the assessment, which can be very disabling for a group of students? Or are we going to say we're going to have a flexible, robust, innovative assessment program that allows for a continuum of opportunities for us to gather information? We need to upskill our teachers in this, we need to upskill our educators, and we need to upskill our community in understanding the benefits of such an approach. This, I hope, will lead to an impact on learners. Decisions be made that result in all learners benefiting, and that data be used to support teachers, schools, and the community to say we have a robust, genuinely rigorous education system that contributes to the benefit of all of us in our community. I'm going to finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for your contribution to this, and thank you very much all for listening to us. We realise that the end of the call is rapidly coming. So thank you again to the Ministry for this very kind invitation. We are more than happy to answer questions. Our email contact is available to you, so please don't hesitate to contact us if you have any questions at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Cathy Little and Dr. David Evans, for sharing with us their international experience in the assessments and special needs. Indeed, education is a lifelong process, and it is the right for every child, including ones with special needs, to receive an equal education. And from your thorough presentation, we can now understand clearly how assessment for students with special needs are carried out in Australia, with a focus on their strength, on their motivation and on their interests. And doctors, looking at the visuals that you've shared, I'm sure all of us here, including me, are looking forward to go to Australia to have the authentic experience of witnessing the assessment with our own eyes. Probably that can happen next year for the next InCoSSAA. On a serious note, how I wish to have a Q&A session. However, time is not on our side as we are getting really close to the closing ceremony of the conference, which will start very soon. We shall communicate with the two of you via email should there be any question put forward by our participants. Meanwhile, we hope to have the two of you for our next InCoSSAA, next conference next year here in Malaysia. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for Dr. Cathy Little and Dr. David Evans. Have a great, productive day, Doctor. Thank you very much. Sidang hadirin sekalian, demikian tadi pembentangan yang dibawakan dari Australia menggunakan Google Meet. Harapan saya dan harapan penganjur semestinya agar tuan-tuan dan puan-puan kini lebih memahami tentang pentaksiran yang dilakukan oleh mereka di Australia dan melihat serta membandingkan pentaksiran yang dilakukan di Malaysia. Sidang hadirin sekalian, majlis penutup akan dijalankan sebentar sahaja lagi, iaitu lebih kurang 15 minit dari sekarang. Tuan-tuan dan puan-puan boleh berehat, bolehlah kalau ada yang nak ke bilik air tandas buat ketika ini boleh, tetapi kerjasama tuan-tuan dan puan-puan sangatlah diharapkan untuk punctual. Okey, punctual 15 minit, datang balik ke sini dan penuhkan kerusi di bahagian hadapan agar cantik visual kita nanti. Pada ketika ini, tuan-tuan masih lagi memenuhi di sebelah belakang. Kita pohon kerjasama tuan-tuan dan puan-puan agar penuhkan dahulu kerusi-kerusi di bahagian hadapan. Cantik sikit visual kita nanti. Sekali lagi, tuan-tuan dan puan-puan, pohon untuk mematuhi masa agar kita dapat selesaikan acara dengan cantik dan teratur, dan kemudian kita perlu uruskan urusan untuk kita check out, balik berjumpa dengan keluarga. Terima kasih.